The Sunday school lesson for January the 5th, 2025 is Calling Sinners to Repentance. Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. Happy New Year to everyone. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson. Calling a disciple, Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Teaching, Mark chapter 2, verse 13. Jesus' fame was spreading all over Galilee, chapter 1, verse 28. After being gone from Capernaum, he returned to the place that he had made his ministry headquarters, chapter 2, verse 1. As soon as the word spread that he was there, 4 men searched him out, carrying a paralyzed man. Because of the crowds, the only way they could reach him was to lower the man from a hole in the roof. Upon seeing the faith of his friends, Jesus told the man his sins were forgiven. Verse 5. He sent him on his way, healed. Verses 11 through 12. That was a mixed reaction. Most of the people were amazed and glorified God because of what they had witnessed. The scribes, on the other hand, considered Jesus' pronouncement of forgiveness blasphemous. Verses 6 through 7. Although they did not verbalize their thoughts, Jesus knew them and confronted them. Verses 8 through 10. This is the first such confrontation with the religious leaders recorded in Mark. The second incident of opposition is recorded in this week's text. As soon as Jesus had told the man to take up his bed and go home, Jesus left the house. Perhaps he wanted to be more in the open and not confined within the walls of a house. It appears that most of Jesus' ministry was out in the open, where he could reach more people with his message. As Jesus walked along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, it did not take long for another crowd to gather around him. He immediately began to teach them. Calling, Mark chapter 2, verse 14. As Jesus was walking along, he passed by a receipt of custom, that is, a tax collector's booth. A man by the name of Levi was operating it. All three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record this incident. Both Mark and Luke refer to the man as Levi, but Matthew calls him Matthew. He was, in fact, the same Matthew who wrote the gospel. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 3, he referred to himself as Matthew the publican or Matthew the tax collector. This was probably a demonstration of his humility, for in referring to himself as a tax collector, Matthew admitted he was once a man hated by his own people. God had been gracious to him in allowing him to be a disciple of Jesus in spite of his past record. Tax collectors were some of the most hated people in Israel. In order to be a tax collector, a person had to purchase the rights for this business from Rome. He could then charge whatever tax he wanted in order to recoup the money he paid to Rome. Tax collectors were considered traitors and extortioners. They were not allowed to be witnesses or judges in court because they were considered untrustworthy. They were excommunicated from the synagogue. When Jesus issued the invitation to Levi to follow him, he immediately arose from his booth and followed. Luke says, and he left all, rose up, and followed him. Chapter 5, verse 28. Jesus called to be a disciple a man who was banned from all religious fellowship and whose money was considered tainted and defiled. Even though he was hated by people, Levi was loved by God. When given the opportunity to serve him, he responded. Associating Mark chapter 2, verse 15. According to Luke chapter 5, verse 29, Levi followed his call by hosting a feast in his house in honor of Jesus. Just as any of us would do, he invited the people he knew best. This resulted in a good number of tax collectors and sinners, for that was the realm in which Levi lived. Jesus apparently saw this as an opportunity to reach into their lives with the truth. Because of Matthew's financial means, he was able to host a great feast. We have no idea how many were in attendance, but we do know there were many present who needed to hear the message Jesus was preaching. In order to reach them, Jesus knew he had to associate with them without making them think he felt superior to them. Among the many following Jesus at this time were some he could never have reached in the synagogue. They had been banned from there. Mark also mentioned that Jesus' disciples were present, as were many others who followed him. Defending a lifestyle, Mark chapter 2, verses 16 through 17. Criticized, Mark chapter 2, verse 16. We noted earlier that this is the second recorded occasion on which Jesus received opposition and criticism from the religious leaders. Once again, the scribes were the ones who caused the problem. These were some of the teachers who prided themselves on being the most learned interpreters of what God had said to mankind through the Mosaic law. These Pharisees, with their young theological students, had come for the purpose of criticism, and the occasion was not long lacking. As they stood beside the wall of the long banquet hall, these hypocrites affected to be horrified that Jesus and his disciples should be eating with publicans and sinners, the pariahs of society. It was Jesus' disciples who were addressed by the scribes, not Jesus himself. It appears they did not want to risk addressing Jesus directly. To understand their fear, we need to recall their previous encounter with him. When the paralyzed man had been let down in front of him, they had thought in their hearts that he was speaking blasphemies against God in telling the man his sins were forgiven. Mark chapter 2, verse 7. Jesus immediately asked them why they were thinking these things. Jesus then asked whether it is easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk. Verse 9. Jesus meant it was easy to tell someone his sins were forgiven without there being any physical proof. It was impossible, however, to tell a paralyzed man, a paralyzed person, to get up and walk without the proof of the power to heal being immediately obvious. Upon telling the man to get up and walk, Jesus proved instantly that he also had the authority to forgive his sins. This incident left the scribes with nothing further to say. They had been exposed in front of all the people and had no way to refute Jesus and redeem themselves. It is not surprising that they sought to avoid another direct confrontation with him. Therefore, it was to his disciples that they accusingly posed the question. Verse 16. It was an underhanded method of criticism. Responding, Mark chapter 2, verse 17. The scribes apparently had not learned their lessons from the previous encounter. If Jesus could read their thoughts, he certainly could hear what they were muttering to his disciples. It might be good to remind ourselves that by sinners, the Pharisees were possibly referring to anyone who did not live by the rigid standards they had set based on their interpretation of the law. They had separated themselves from all they considered sinners, and they had a very superior attitude. Jesus succinctly explained his presence by stating that people who are not sick do not need a doctor, but that those who are sick do. In the same way, he did not come for the purpose of calling righteous people to repentance. Rather, he came to reach sinners. He was associating with them because they were the ones who needed him the most. What he had to offer was salvation from their sins. Although he did not specifically say so, there is a hint in Jesus' response that he knew the scribes considered themselves to be righteous already and, thus, not in need of anything from him. As self righteous ones, they could not recognize their own need for repentance. Levi, or Matthew, instantly recognized his spiritual need. His response and subsequent ministry show us how God can use those who obey him. Thank you so much for listening, and join me soon for the next Read with Me. Stay safe and may God bless.